Welcome back. So, in this episode of The Rabbit Hole, we'll be talking about the Cold War, how it developed from two powers vying for control of the world, a capitalist nation and a communist nation. We'll be starting about how the Cold War started, the who, what, when, where, why, and all that, as well as views from historians. Then we'll be talking about how Truman and Stalin as our placeholders for the early years of the Cold War and kind of set precedent of how the early years of the Cold War would go. Then we'll be ending it with Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, and how their policies were very different to the early years and how that changed and shaped the Cold War near its end. Then we'll be wrapping up to see who was the winner or who was the real loser. Depends. But we'll see. Why do I hear boxing bells? Now that he's dealt with, I'm taking over. Name's Ref. And I'll be talking about this fight between the USA and the USSR. What?
Context.
Apparently I gotta give you context. Ugh. I hate my job. The Cold War is kind of like a boxing match. What? I'm not allowed to do sports metaphors because I don't understand sports.
Yes.
Shut up. The Cold War is like a boxing match with two major sides fighting against each other: a capitalist democracy and a authoritarian communist nations. I should mention though that this is not a fight of authoritarianism and democracy. That's just not true. It's capitalism and communism. I'll discuss what those are in a second. But first, a word from our sponsors. The historians that we'll be sourcing today are brought to you by the National Library of Australia. I'm not actually sponsored, I'm just pointing out where my sources are coming from. That's it.
You know you don't have to plug it.
What do you mean I don't have to plug? It's funnier this way. So, how did it start? This is our how. It started because of many factors. Some say from the Berlin Wall, but personally, I think it was because of both sides being extremely paranoid of each other, from Truman and Winston Churchill being both very anti-communist, Winston being one of the most anti-communist people I think I've found in a long time, and Stalin being Stalin, a paranoid man who would kill anything. That's just Stalin for you. On top of this, I think the catalyst was probably the Berlin Wall being lifted. Other major factors that affected the Cold War's start is the Truman Doctrine, a doctrine which is essentially the support of non-communist forces across the world. These started in Greece and Turkey respectively to contain their communist threats. On top of this was also the formation of NATO, which is an organization that still holds up today. Even some historians believe that Truman was the originator of... Truman's speech announcing the Truman Doctrine was the beginning of the Cold War. We got a lot to get through in the early Cold War, so let's get through it fast. We got the Iranian conflict, which I know basically nothing about. We got the Turkish Strait crisis, again, don't know much about. Then we got the Greek Civil War with the USSR not helping much. That's weird. Then you got Truman and Truman's containment policy and domino theory by Eisenhower. Then you got the Korean War with two awful dictators. Don't you forget that. Then you got China and Vietnam. Then you got the Berlin airlift in the early part. That was cool. And then the space race in Cuba. That was close to the end of the world. And the...
Slow down.
What?
Slow down.
No. Then we got the Berlin Wall 2 and 3, Berlin crises 2 and 3, and then you got the Marshall Plan, and the Hungary Revolution, the Czech Spring, and then the Third World interventions, and then the thawing. And then the policies!
I'm free. I got out of the dungeon. I didn't know we had one. Thanks, staff.
You're welcome.
Okay, ref's out for the count for now, I hope. Let's talk about the policies.
After the end of the 18 months of what was left of FDR's presidency, Truman was not re-elected. Who replaced him? Well, Dwight Eisenhower, a World War I/World War II veteran, a very staunchly anti-communist man, and the person who invented the domino theory, as well as a couple of other things. But I should probably focus on the domino theory. The domino theory is the theory that if one nation fell to communism, it would spread. It would fall to the next and the next and the next. The best example is if Vietnam fell to communism, then it must spread to Laos, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Australia, maybe even through Myanmar to God forbid, India. Eisenhower could not accept these staunch allies to the US fall to communism. This also was a threat in the Americas, as Guatemala looked like it could fall to communism. He could not allow that. And if it fell with the domino theory, it could fall to Mexico, being right on the border of the US, and he could not accept that. Connecting back to the policy of containment, this was the implementation of that, of containing communism to the best of their abilities by fiddling with internal affairs of different nations, causing civil wars and civil strife. Now, with that, let's go over to the USSR and see what their policies were through this period. Unlike in the USA, the USSR did not have free elections. Obviously, it's a one-party communist state. In this, that allowed Stalin to stay in control till his death in 1953. During this time, he would become a pain in the side of the Western world. As Stalin had some weird stuff. He supported the North Koreans in the Korean War. He helped the Chinese communists in the Chinese Civil War. But he did not want to help in the Greek Civil War. The reason for this I do not know, and I'll find that out when I do a video on the Greek Civil War, because that seems like a cool video. But I digress. He also had the biggest tension and standoff during the Berlin blockade / Berlin airlift. That was pretty scary. With that, we also had the Russo-Yugo split, or that's just the name I came up with. The split between Stalin and Tito being the leader of Yugoslavia. That split left another split of communism from it, which isn't super important, but I think it's worth mentioning. On top of this, to counter NATO, the US's alliance against the communists, Stalin formed the Warsaw Pact with the puppets of communism, as well as places such as Mongolia, Yugoslavia, Albania, as well as other nations that were communist. With that, it formed the Warsaw Pact. This will continue to the end of the Cold War, so this is another really important thing. But unlike NATO, it will not survive to the modern day. Now, what about after Stalin's death? What happened? Well, let's find out. So, Khrushchev would take over after Stalin after a small power struggle between him and many others in the party. With that, he was a fresh face to the Western world. Many saw him as a relief and maybe an end to the Cold War. They were completely wrong. Khrushchev promised freedom and liberty to the peoples of the satellite states of the Warsaw Pact. What he gave them was minor freedoms and brutal repression. With this brutal repression, the Western world stopped looking favourably on Khrushchev. But why were they looking favourably in the first place? Didn't they hate communists? Well, yeah, they did. But what they saw in Khrushchev was a man wanting to reform the USSR. He did. He wanted to reform and de-Stalinize. De-Stalinization, which I just mentioned, is the process of repairing the... Let me put it in just a kind of funny way. He essentially said, hey, do you know how Stalin was murdering tons of us for no reason? Yeah, that was bad. Cue gasps and shocks. I think my editor could probably put that in. Oh yeah, my editor's me. So, I'm shocked. There we go. Nice gasps. With that... That was so stupid. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very important point, as it was probably the second closest we've ever gotten to nuclear Armageddon. To vastly oversimplify, I'm going to also, quickly before I forget, I'm going to also recommend the really good video by Extra Credits History on the Cuban Missile Crisis until I make my own. Then I'm going to replace that link with one of my own. Self-shilling! With that, the Cuban Missile Crisis was basically a standoff between JFK, the president after Eisenhower, and Khrushchev. This was tense, as at one point, one nuclear submarine that was in this blockade of the Cuban Missile Crisis almost fired nuclear weapons. That would have been the end of the world, but thankfully level heads won the day. Even though clearer heads prevailed, it wouldn't last. Kennedy would be assassinated soon after the Cuban Missile Crisis was averted. Not before he sent advisory troops to Vietnam, and his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, would send more troops to Vietnam, properly cracking on the Vietnam War. This would make Vietnam one of the most infamous wars in the United States consciousness. With that, Lyndon B. Johnson did not get in for his second proper term. Instead, he was replaced by Nixon, who would continue the war, but after heavy pressure by the public, would pull out of Vietnam, going into a phase of the Cold War known as Dante. Dante is essentially a word coming from French. I don't know what its direct meaning is, but I'll give you the word so you can search it up yourself if you like. But from my understanding, it essentially means the easing of tensions. Dante was a period during the Cold War where the tensions between the US and the USSR eased. It would not last, as President Jimmy Carter was pulled around by his cabinet, specifically Blensky, who I'm probably butchering, so I'll put his name up here, as well as the failed SALT II convention to reduce nuclear arms, as Brezhnev, the leader of the USSR, would intervene in Afghanistan, creating their own Vietnam. As I'm strapped for time, I'm not going to be able to go into Afghanistan as much as I really would like to, so I'm going to make a video another time, that may be far in the future, I don't know. But anyway, Afghanistan had the same problems as Vietnam, with PR nightmare, not as bad in USSR as it already had media oppression, as well as Brezhnev dying. He was a key to holding the USSR together, as after him, they would have successive leader deaths, mainly from just old age, because it became a leadership of elderly men who did not know what the world was actually like. Now we're in the final years of the Cold War, and, well, we're going to talk about the USSR first this time, because, well, we're going to be talking about my personal favourite leader, Gorbachev. But first, some context. Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union for the most of the time-ish, was ruled for 17 years. Then he died. His successor was Yuri something rather, and then Konstantin. Notably, they both died within a year. Konstantin especially had heavy smoking issues and was pretty much on death's door when he was elected leader. He was hospitalized for most of his rule. He was an old guard. Both of these people were born before the 1920s. So, the old guard was dying out, and the new guard needed to come in. Cue Gorbachev, a radical reformer and a person who recently died in August 30th, 2022. With the passing of Gorbachev, I think it's a good time to talk about what made him such a good leader. Well, at least a good leader in my opinion. Gorbachev had two major factors that I believe made him such a great leader. Or at least a nice person. First, his cooperation with the West. For the first time in decades, he opened up the Russia to Western ideals and companies. Notably, one of the most famous things about Gorbachev is his cooperation with bloody Pizza Hut. I'll put a link to that drug trip of an ad. As well as his doing business with people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Margaret Thatcher quoting Margaret Thatcher about Gorbachev is, "I like Mr. Gorbachev. We can do business together." I may have been in the dungeon for 2 weeks, but you cannot get rid of me that easily. Especially you, Staff.
Pass did it.
Staff, that's pretty good ice cream.
Yeah, thanks. It's homemade.
Why is it recording, Staff?
Well, you did knock out Pass, and we have a video to finish.
Do I have to?
I'll give you more ice cream.
Deal.
You're into the deal first.
Conclusion. I think there's many factors that can decide, can I just eat the ice cream now?
No, we had a deal.
Fine. There's many factors to decide who came out on top in the Cold War. My personal opinion, and the opinion of the scriptwriter, which is also past, is the US. As well, the US is still standing, and the USSR is now tons of different nations, 14 to be precise, I think. So, I think the USSR won, but the USSR also won in influence. It became a symbol of communism, as well as a starter for nations like modern-day China, North Korea, Vietnam, and I think Cambodia? I never remember. Oh yeah, and Cuba. Now I need to actually talk about this like it's a bloody conclusion. So, in conclusion, the Cold War is a complex network of nightmarish proportions as post-revisionist, and orthodox.
Other video.
What? That's for another video? Ugh. Tell Past I'm not intervening in the next one. Anyway, with that, we have many different views on who won the Cold War. And, well, who was right, who was wrong. It's not really pointful, though. The Cold War is just an event in history, in my opinion. Many things happened. It's confusing. Good night.